There are choices you make in the dark, ones nobody sees, ones you never speak aloud. And somehow, those are the ones that follow you longest. You know the kind. The ones you justify so carefully that the justification starts to sound like wisdom. The ones you carry for years before you finally understand what they actually were. This is a story about one of those choices. Callan left before sunrise. He didn't light a lantern. He didn't eat. He saddled the gray mare in silence, cinching the straps with practiced hands that moved faster than his thoughts did, because thinking was the thing he was trying not to do. The horse stirred beneath him as he tightened the girth, stamping once against the cold earth, and he pressed his palm flat against her neck for just a moment. A long moment. Longer than it needed to be. Then he rode out. The town behind him was still asleep. The single street sat quiet under a sky the color of charcoal, the lanterns unlit, the windows dark. He didn't look back at the town. He never did, when leaving a place. It was a habit he'd held through enough departures that it had become something close to a personal law. You leave, and then it's behind you, and the space between you and the thing you've left is where your attention belongs now. The journey ahead was 3 weeks of dry country, maybe 4. Rocky escarpments to the north, cracked flats to the south, and nothing in any direction that promised shade or water before the 3rd day. He had done stretches like this before, the long crossings where the land reduced itself to heat and rock in the particular quality of silence you only find far from anything human. He had always done them with the mare. Her name, the one he'd never said out loud to another person but thought every single day for 9 years, was simply Gray. Not a grand name. Not a name he'd chosen with any particular ceremony or sentiment. She had been Gray the morning they found each other outside a collapsing livery stable in a town he had no reason to be in, and Gray she had remained through all the years since, her coat the particular soft silver of early morning fog over water. The kind of color that changed depending on the light. In full sun she was almost white. In shadow she went deep as pewter. At dusk she seemed to absorb the dying color of the sky and hold it for a moment before the dark came. He supposed the name had chosen itself. Most of the good ones did. He had been 23 when they found each other. She had found him, more accurately. He'd been standing in the dirt outside a collapsing stable, watching the owner argue with 2 men about a debt that was clearly not going to be resolved, when he felt something push firmly against his shoulder from behind. He'd turned expecting a person. Instead it was the gray horse, her nose against him, her eyes doing that particular thing horses' eyes do when they have decided about you and are simply waiting for you to catch up to the decision they've already made. The stable owner said she didn't like people, hadn't let anyone near her in 3 weeks. Callan bought her before the man finished the sentence. He had never regretted it. Not once, in 9 years. Not until now, perhaps. And even now, he told himself, he wasn't regretting it. He was doing the practical thing. By the 3rd day of the journey, it became clear to him what he had been trying not to see for the last week. Gray was struggling. She had been limping so subtly on the left foreleg that he'd almost convinced himself it was the terrain. Just the loose shale. Just the uneven ground where the dry creek bed crossed the path. Horses moved differently on broken ground. It wasn't necessarily a sign of anything. He had told himself this through the 1st day and into the 2nd, and some part of him had almost believed it. But by midday on the 3rd day, he could no longer make that argument even to himself. Her breathing was labored in a way it shouldn't have been on flat ground at a walking pace. She was drinking more than she should at every stop, dunking her nose deeper than usual, taking her time. Her coat, which he brushed every morning as a matter of routine, felt different under his hands. Less settled. And when he dismounted on the 3rd afternoon to check her shoe, bending down in the white dust with the sun beating on the back of his neck, The heat he felt radiating from the joint above the shoe sent a cold thread of fear straight through his chest. That kind of heat didn't come from terrain. That kind of heat came from something that had been building for a while. He camped really that night, in the thin shade of a rock shelf that wasn't quite big enough to do much good. He stripped her tack and checked her over again in the fading light, running his hands down each leg in turn, pressing gently at the joints and tendons, watching her face for the small signs. She was patient through all of it. She had always been patient when he examined her. Even as a young horse, barely settled, she had understood that his hands on her legs meant something different from other touches. He had taught her that, or perhaps she had simply known it. He was never entirely certain who had taught whom what, with Gray. He built the fire small and sat beside it and looked at her, and she looked back at him the way she always did. That patient, direct attention she gave him. Like she was waiting for him to decide something. Like that was their arrangement. He decided the hard things. She trusted he would decide well. That had always been their arrangement. He sat with it for a long time. By morning he had made a calculation, or told himself it was a calculation, which was perhaps not the same thing. The terrain ahead was worse than what they'd covered. Longer stretches between water. More broken ground. Another 8 days at minimum to the next settlement, and that was assuming good conditions, and good conditions in this particular country were not something you could assume. He thought about what 8 more days would do to a leg that was already inflamed. A horse cannot rest properly in open country, not real rest, not the kind that reduces swelling and lets a tendon or a joint kneel back into its right position. Movement aggravates. Heat builds. And if the leg gave out entirely 3 or 4 days further in, with nothing around them but rock and distance, the situation would become something much worse than it currently was. She deserved better than that. That was the thing he came back to, again and again, as the first pale light touched the edges of the sky. She deserved better. He had covered this ground before without her. He could do it again. And she would be fine. There was water at the creek where they'd camped. There was thin grass along the banks. Animals survived out here all the time without human assistance. She would rest, and the leg would heal, and eventually she would find her way to grazing land or to some passing traveler who would recognize a quality horse and treat her accordingly. He made himself believe all of this. He told himself this while he unsaddled her, working the buckles in the gray morning light, lifting the saddle clear and setting it on a flat rock nearby. He told himself this while he walked her down to the creek and let her drink. While he stood there and watched her lower her nose to the water. While he ran his hand down the length of her nose one last time, slowly, the way she liked, starting between her eyes and drawing his palm all the way to the soft place above her nostrils. She pushed into his hand, the way she always did. He turned and walked away. He told himself he was doing the right thing right up until the moment his boots found the track again and he put distance between himself and the sound of the creek. And even then he kept saying it, quietly, under his breath, like a thing that needs repeating is a thing you believe. Like saying it enough times would make the cold feeling at his chest mean something different. He did not look back. That was the rule he had made for himself in the space between unsaddling her and walking away. One rule, clear and simple. Don't look back. If you look back, you will see her standing at the edge of the creek, watching you go, and then you won't go. And if you don't go, you'll stay, and if you stay you'll push her further than she can go, and something will break that you can't unbreak in the middle of nowhere with nothing to help you. Don't look back. He didn't. The first day alone was almost peaceful, in the way that amputations are sometimes described as painless in the first hours before the body understands what has happened. He carried his own pack, which was heavy but manageable. The silence of the land opened up around him with a completeness he hadn't expected. No soft breathing at his shoulder. No rhythm of hooves behind him. No occasional huff when something caught her attention. Just his own footsteps, and the wind, and the hiss of dry grass against his boots. He made good time. He told himself this several times through the afternoon. He was free of all that. That was the word he used in his head. Free. He told himself it was fine all the way through the long afternoon and into the dusk, when the sky went the color of an old bruise and the temperature dropped fast. He made his fire small and lay on his back looking up at a sky that seemed enormous without the warm weight of a horse nearby. The stars were the same stars. They always were. They seemed, somehow, more indifferent than usual. He had never particularly minded the indifference of the sky. It had always felt clean to him. Honest. That night it felt like something else. He slept badly. He woke twice and lay listening to the silence and told himself the silence was fine. That it was what he had chosen. The second night, he heard her. He was almost asleep when it started. A sound, faint and distant, coming from behind him, from the direction he had come from. He lay still for a moment and listened, because the land did play tricks, especially at night when the air was cold and still and sound could travel across the flats with strange fidelity, arriving intact from distances that seemed impossible. A coyote far off could sound almost like something close. A stone settling on a slope could, in the right conditions, produce a sound very like a footstep. He lay still and cataloged these possibilities with great methodical care. The sound continued. Steady. Rhythmic. Growling, very slowly, louder. 3 beats, with a slight catch on the 4th. A movement pattern he knew so precisely that he recognized it before he had fully decided to recognize it. Left foreleg. He thought this before he even sat up. His body knew it before his mind had finished the argument. That's her gait. That particular hitch. That particular 3-and-1 that she had always had since he'd known her. Not a limp exactly, not even particularly noticeable unless you knew what you were listening for. But he knew what he was listening for. He had known that sound for 9 years. He turned. She was standing at the edge of the firelight, just at the border of the orange glow, where the light ended and the dark country began. Standing completely still, as she had always stood when she was being very calm and very deliberate about something. Her coat had caught the fire along one side, amber and copper in the glow, and the other side of her was shadow. Her ears were forward. Her eyes were on him. She had come at least 4 miles. Through terrain that had no particular business being kind to a horse on a bad leg, in full dark, with nothing to follow except whatever it is that some creatures use for navigation when maps and landmarks aren't available. She had crossed the dry creek bed and the shale flat in the long section of broken ground near the old wash. She had found the fire from some direction that she had determined on her own. And she was looking at him with the exact same expression she always had. Patient. Specific. Quiet. Like he was the thing she had been oriented toward all along, and everything else, the country and the dark and the miles and the bad leg, was just geography she had moved through to get back to the correct arrangement of things. Colin sat there for a long time without moving. He wanted to say something. He wanted to say several things, actually, and none of them were adequate to the moment, and some of them would have embarrassed him even with no one else present to hear them. The things he might have said were too large and too old and had too many rooms inside them. So he said the only thing that actually came out of his mouth. "You shouldn't be here," he said. His voice was quieter than he intended. Rougher. Gray did not move. She didn't back away. She didn't toss her head or stamp or snork or do any of the things a horse does when it is uncertain or skittish or making a point. She simply remained where she was, in that particular, absolute stillness of hers, the one that had always felt to him less like the stillness of an animal waiting to be told what to do and more like the stillness of a decision that had already been made and was simply waiting for the world to catch up to it. He stood up slowly. He walked toward her, his boots quiet in the dust, the fire behind him throwing his shadow long and thin across the ground ahead. When he reached her, he stood for a moment and then he put both hands on either side of her face, his palms against her jaw, his thumbs along her cheekbones, and stood close enough that he could feel the warmth coming off her coat and hear the slow, steady rhythm of her breathing. She leaned into him. Just slightly. Just enough. He stood there for a while. He did not sleep much that night either, but for entirely different reasons than the night before. In the gray pre-dawn light, before the sun had fully committed to the horizon, he checked her leg. Carefully, the way he always did, running his fingers along the tendons and pressing gently at the joint above the hoof. Still warm. Still swollen. But not worse than it had been 2 days ago. He pressed slightly harder and watched her face. She flicked one ear but didn't flinch, didn't pull away. He ran his hand up the leg and back down again, feeling the heat, feeling where it was concentrated, trying to build a picture from what his hands could find. She stood perfectly still through all of it. She always had. Even as a very young horse, barely halt or broken, before she'd had years of specific reason to trust him, she had stood still when he examined her. He had thought about this over the years, the fact that she had trusted his hands on her legs from almost the beginning, when she hadn't yet trusted much else. He had never been entirely sure what that meant or what he had done to earn it. He wasn't sure you did anything to earn that kind of trust from a horse. He thought perhaps it was simply offered, the way certain things are offered, without conditions and without a clear explanation for why. He made a decision in the dawn light. A real one this time, not dressed up in the borrowed clothes of a calculation. They would go slower. Much slower. They would stop earlier each day, well before the worst of the afternoon heat, and find whatever shade the country offered, which was not always much but was usually something. They would be careful about the ground, choosing the softest line available, even when that line was longer. They would stop whenever he felt she needed it, regardless of how much distance was left in the day. It would take longer. It would probably take considerably longer than he'd originally planned. There were people expecting him at the other end of this crossing, and those people would wait, or they wouldn't, and that was something he would deal with when he got there. But they would go together, at whatever pace she could manage, and they would see what was on the other side. The days that followed were hard in the particular way that things are hard when you are doing them with someone who needs you to be paying attention. Not hard like endurance, where you simply lower your head and keep moving. Hard like care, where you have to stay present and calibrated and willing to change course. Every morning, before he ate or broke camp, Callan checked her leg. Both hands on the joint, feeling for heat. Fingers along the tendon. Watching her face for any sign of reaction. Then he would make his assessment of the day, and they would begin. She had started to anticipate it. By the third morning, when he came to her in the pre-dawn, she would shift her weight slightly so that the left leg was more accessible. That small adjustment, that small communication. Every afternoon he monitored her breathing and adjusted their pace accordingly. He learned to read her in finer detail than before, or perhaps he always had the ability and had simply never needed to use it this precisely. The way her nostrils moved, the angle of her ears, the small variations in how she placed her feet. He had always known her well. These days he knew her differently. On the fourth morning, she moved without the hitch. Not entirely gone, not yet, but reduced to something so faint he might have missed it if he hadn't been watching for it. He didn't say anything. He wasn't a man who said things to horses, not in words, not generally. But he noticed, and some part of them settled that had been held tight for days, and she probably felt that in the small relaxation of his hands on the reins, because she tossed her head once, briefly, the way she did when something changed to her satisfaction. They moved through the land slowly and with attention, not fighting the terrain but reading it. Callan began to notice things he wouldn't have seen at a faster pace. The way the light moved across the red rock faces in the early morning, turning them briefly almost pink before the sun bleached everything to white. The families of finches that exploded out of the thorn scrub when disturbed, then resettled just ahead, waiting. The tracks of something large that crossed their path each morning, always heading the same direction, toward the distant hills. Whatever it was, it seemed to have a destination. He found that strangely encouraging. On the 5th day they found unexpected shade, a deep overhang of red rock that held the cool air from the night. He stopped there in the early afternoon and let her rest while he sat in the shadow and watched the heat rise from the flat ground outside. She dozed. He watched her breathe. The quality of the afternoon felt suspended, outside of time. He thought about the creek where he'd left her. He had deflected the thought for days, moving past it quickly before it could fully form. Now, with nothing pressing, he let himself look at it. The morning he had unsaddled her and walked away. The careful preparation of the justification. The rules he had made for himself. Don't look back. As if the only obstacle between him and doing the right thing had been his own tendency toward sentiment. The thing was, he had genuinely believed it. That was the hardest part to account for. He had genuinely believed that leaving her was the thoughtful choice. Her leg had been bad. The terrain ahead had been worse. The logic had held together, in its way. But she had not agreed with the conclusion. She had disagreed, quietly and without argument, by covering 4 miles of bad country in the dark on a bad lag and appearing at the edge of his fire. Without drama. Without any apparent expectation that this would be received as anything other than obvious. And if you're still with us right now, following this road alongside Callan and Gray, then maybe you already feel what this story is about. You can leave a like, or just stay a while longer. We're glad to have you here. He stayed in the shade until the worst of the afternoon passed. Then he resettled her and they moved on, and the light began its long decline toward the horizon, and the country turned the colors it only turned at that hour, amber and rust in a reddish gold that lasted perhaps 30 minutes before the dark came. On the 6th day, she walked the whole morning without any sign of the limp at all. The settlement appeared on the 9th day, rising out of the heat shimmer as a dark irregularity on the horizon that gradually sorted itself into buildings. Low, flat-roofed, the color of the surrounding earth. A thread of smoke. The suggestion of trees. He stopped and looked at it for a moment, feeling the particular complicated feeling that settlements produced after a long crossing, relief, slight weariness, the knowledge that the open country, which had been demanding and honest, was about to be replaced with something populated and much less straightforward. Gray's ears went forward. She was reading the horizon with the focused attention she gave to new things. "All right," Callan said. Not to her specifically, just to the fact of having arrived. They rode in together. A man named Aldrin ran the livery stable at the south end of the main street. He had the manner of someone who had seen enough horses to have lost patience with people who romanticized them, but enough genuine respect for the animals to be trusted with their care. He came out to look Gray over before agreeing to a price, moving around her with efficient, practiced hands. When he got to the left foreleg, he slowed down. "She's been favoring this one," Aldrin said. Not an accusation. A professional observation. "Some," Callan said. "Heat's still in it." "Less than there was." Aldrin stood up and looked at him. Not unfriendly. Just assessing. "She'll need real rest. Not 2 days. More like 10. "I know," Colin said. Something in the way he said it, or perhaps in his face, made Aldrin look at him a moment longer than the conversation required. Then he just nodded and clicked his tongue and led Gray inside, and Callan stood in the stable yard with his hands loose at his sides and listened to her hooves on the wooden floor as they receded down the aisle, and kept listening until he couldn't hear them anymore. He stayed in that settlement for 12 days. He told himself, in the beginning, that it was business. There were supplies to restock, information to gather about the country ahead, the condition of the passes, the reliability of the water sources in the next long stretch. These things were true and necessary and took some portion of his time. But not 12 days worth. Not nearly. What took 12 days was the knowledge that Gray's leg needed more time than he was inclined to give it, and that he was the one with the power to give it to her or not, and that this was, when he actually looked at it plainly, a very uncomplicated thing. He had a choice, and the choice was obvious, and the only thing that had ever made it feel complicated was his own impatience, his own urgency, his own deep resistance to being slower than he wanted to be. Those things were real. They had their own weight. But they were not, as it turned out, sufficient reason to repeat what he had done at the creek. He spent part of each day at the stable. He told himself, the first few times, that he was checking on her condition. And that was true. But mostly he was just there, sitting on the low bench outside her stall in the cool of the stable, with the smell of hay and horses and old wood around him, watching her eat or rest or investigate the stall with the methodical curiosity she brought to new environments. She had always done that with unfamiliar spaces, moved through them with a kind of systematic attention, checking each corner, examining each object she could reach, as if she were conducting an audit. He had always found it quietly entertaining. On the fourth day, she stopped doing the audit when he came in. She just turned to look at him and then went back to her hay, which meant, he understood, that the stall had been sufficiently investigated and accepted, and his arrival was now a known and unremarkable thing. He found this unreasonably satisfying. On the seventh evening, he sat on the bench outside her stall for a long time after the stable had grown dark and quiet. The other horses settled into their nighttime breathing. A lamp burned low at the far end of the aisle. He sat in the dimness and thought about the word he had used at the creek, repeating it like a reason. Deserve. She deserves somewhere safe. She deserves to rest. The thing about that word was how cleanly it had worked. How easily it had let him feel generous while doing something that was, at its bottom, about his own management of difficulty. It had been dressed in her welfare so convincingly that he had not seen the other thing inside it. The desire to simplify. The desire to move forward without the weight of her condition following him, without the need to adjust and slow and attend. He had dressed that desire up in language about what she deserved, and the costume had fit so well that he had worn it all the way to the creek and back and not noticed what it was until 4 miles of dark country showed him. She had not asked to be managed. She had not asked to be protected from the journey. She had made her own assessment of what she could manage and had acted on it, without ceremony and without complaint and without waiting for permission. He sat with that for a long time in the dim stable. She looked up at him once from her feet, briefly, with that steady attention, then went back to it. "All right," he said quietly. To himself, mostly, though perhaps not entirely. There is a particular kind of loyalty that does not negotiate its terms. That does not arrive with conditions attached or wait for the optimal moment or consult the map of how things are supposed to go. It simply orients toward the thing it belongs to and begins to move. It crosses difficult country in the dark, on legs that aren't at their best, following something it cannot name but doesn't need to. It finds the fire. It stands at the edge of the light, in that precise posture of quiet arrival, and it waits for the person it has chosen to stop moving long enough to notice what has been there all along. Callan had believed, for a long time, that he understood something about leaving. He had left enough places, enough situations, enough things and people to feel that he had developed a working relationship with the act. You identified what needed to be left. You made a clean decision. You went. And if you felt bad about it, that feeling was the cost of moving forward, and you paid it and you kept going, and eventually it dissolved into the background of everything else you were carrying, and you got on. He had applied this logic to Gray with what had felt at the time like genuine thoughtfulness. She had applied her own logic. Different premises, different conclusion. Hers had been tested against 4 miles of hard country in the dark, and his had been tested against nothing except his own conviction. He knew which one he trusted more. Now, they left on the morning of the 13th day. The sky was the pale, transparent blue it was at that hour, before the sun climbed high enough to bleach it. The air was cold in the specific way of early desert mornings, a cold that had weight and clarity in that Callan had always found bracing rather than uncomfortable. He had slept well the last several nights, better than he had in a long time. He had noticed this without entirely understanding it. Aldrin came out to help him saddle up, which Callan hadn't asked for but didn't turn down. The liveryman checked the foreleg one last time with his practiced hands, standing up afterward with an expression that was not quite satisfied but not worried either. "She'll do," he said. "I know," Callan said. And he did know. He could see it in how she stood. The even weight on all 4 legs. The quality of her attention, alert and easy rather than the slightly drawn quality that pain produced. They rode out through the south end of the settlement in the early morning light. Gray moved beneath him with her usual economy, her stride long and unhurried, her hooves finding the ground with that particular soft sureness she had. The bad leg was quiet. He felt the rhythm of her gait, that familiar 4-beat pattern he had sat with for 9 years, and it was clean. No hitch. No favoring. Just that stride, steady and easy as breathing. He had been riding for perhaps an hour. The settlement shrunk behind him to a dark suggestion at the edge of his peripheral vision, the land opening up ahead into its long pale distances, when he noticed that he was smiling. He wasn't sure when it had started. He hadn't decided to smile. It had arrived the way warmth arrives sometimes in a cold room, gradually, without your having done anything to cause it, until you realize it's there and has been there for a while. The corner of his mouth was pulled up slightly and he felt it in his face and recognized it for what it was without being entirely sure what to do about it. He let it stay. The land opened ahead of them, wide and pale and full of the particular kind of distance that this country specialized in. Distance that didn't feel empty. Distance that felt, instead, like room. Like the world clearing its throat before saying something, taking a long breath before the long sentence. He had always understood this country better than most people seemed to. Had always felt something in its openness that other people seemed to experience as hostility. He felt it that morning in a way that was different from how he had felt it before. Cleaner, maybe. Like something had been resolved that he hadn't known was unresolved. Like the math of the last 2 weeks had finally balanced. Gray's ears moved, tracking something ahead, some sound or scent he couldn't detect. He felt the slight shift in her attention through the reins, through the movement of her back beneath him. He knew that shift. He knew 100 small things about how she moved and what they meant, a vocabulary built over 9 years of shared country. He knew her the way you know a language you learned before you knew you were learning it. They rode on. There is a thing that happens, sometimes, with the choices you make in the dark. You carry them forward without really understanding their weight, and days go by, or weeks, or years, and then one morning you find yourself somewhere very ordinary, riding through pale early light over open country, and you feel the shape of the thing you did and the thing that followed from it with sudden, complete clarity. And you understand that the story you were telling yourself about it, the sensible story, the practical story, the story in which you were being thoughtful and careful and realistic, was only one of the stories available. and that the truer story was simpler. And that the simpler story had arrived in the dark at the edge of your fire and stood there quietly until you were ready to see it. You didn't leave the horse behind. Not really. Because she had already made her own decision about what leaving meant, and what staying meant. And 4 miles of bad country in full dark, on a leg that wasn't right, had simply been the evidence of that decision. Not a miracle. Not a mystery. Just the plain, uncomplicated expression of a loyalty that had not needed his permission to exist, had not consulted his calculations, had not been diminished by his absence, and had found him in the darkness simply and certainly as light finds its way through the smallest opening. He had thought, once, that he was the one who decided the hard things. He understood now that she had always been deciding right alongside him. He had just not always been paying attention. The country rolled ahead. The morning held. Gray moved beneath him with that long, easy stride, and Callan let his hands rest light on the reins, and they went on together through the open land, which was still empty and still demanding and still entirely honest, the way the country always was, the way it had always been. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, he thought, exactly what it was supposed to be. If this story stayed with you, even a little, you can leave a like, or drop a thought in the comments below. And if you'd like to find your way back to stories like this one, you're welcome to subscribe. We'll be here whenever you need somewhere quiet to land.